Welcome to Behavioral Health Today, a podcast brought to you by the Triad Network. This podcast is designed to share trending topics occurring within the world and our communities and bring them a behavioral and mental health perspective.
Welcome to Behavioral Health Today. I'm your host, Sharlee Dixon, and joining me today is Peter Fenger. Hey, Peter.
Hey, Sharlee, I'm happy to be here.
Awesome, thanks. Welcome back to another BHT Bytes episode, where we break down mental health and societal trends into quick, digestible conversations, keeping things informative, relaxed, and relevant. Today, we're tackling a topic that affects nearly 1 in 5 American adults and has become a huge source of contention in our recent political landscape: student loans. So, for decades, higher education has been viewed as the great equalizer, the pathway to better jobs, upward mobility, and a secure future. But for millions of Americans, 45 million to be exact, that promise comes with a price tag that can last a lifetime. Today, student loan debt in the United States exceeds $1.7 trillion, reshaping the financial and social realities for entire generations. This episode dives into how student loan debt affects more than just the borrower's bank account, from delaying homeownership and family planning to altering career paths and limiting economic opportunity. This burden touches nearly every corner of modern life. We'll also look at how the pandemic, government policy, and financial literacy, or the lack thereof, intersect with this growing crisis. So the question isn't just how much student loan debt people carry, it's what that debt is costing us as a society. So to kind of set things up, the cost of college has more than doubled over the past 4 decades, and student loan borrowing has risen right along with it. The student loan debt balance in the United States has increased by 66% just in the past decade. The problem is more complex than just folks borrowing money. I mean, I don't know about you, Peter, but when I was growing up, there wasn't really a discussion around if I would attend college, but simply where and what college I would go to. We were taught in every school that I attended, from elementary right on up to high school, that you must attend college to get a better job and ultimately lead a more successful life. No one wanted to be the one that didn't get accepted or didn't have the right grades or extracurricular activities to be granted access to being a productive citizen. There were not many other options offered that gave the same level of appeal. Of course, counselors kind of glazed over technical or trade school and maybe even the local community college, but they were explained in far less grandeur and with an air of inferiority. So, well meaning teenagers completed their FAFSA applications with little preparation and were offered loans to pay for their price and their piece of the American dream, not knowing how the process really works. Truthfully, unless your parents or other family members went to college, you had no idea what you were really signing yourself up for and what that type of debt and how it would impact the rest of your life. Federal student loans are unlike other loans, like a car or credit cards, as there are other differences with eligibility and statute of limitations. Federal student loans do not involve a credit check, so eligibility is not based on the borrower's credit history. So there's no way to say, I believe that you have a certain way to pay these bills. We're just going to give you this money. You just can have it. They also do not have a statute of limitations, as there's no time limit on how long you can be paying on the loan and cannot be discharged with traditional means of bankruptcy. Interest on the loans is also compounding, so it is not uncommon for balances to reach well over their original principal balance due to not being able to make payments because of economic hardship or returning to school. Statistically speaking, women borrow more money for college compared to men simply because they earn the majority of degrees at all levels, everything from certificates to doctorate degrees. And Black students borrow more compared to all other races and ethnicities, potentially due to lack of familial wealth and higher rates of first generation college entrance. Student debt is most common in the 25 to 34 age group, but the greatest amount of debt is owed by those between 35 and 49.
Mhm.
The average amount of debt is about 39,000 per borrower, but that is largely dependent, on the school that you go to, geographic location, and the degree that you sought. So I've got friends whose debt has equal over $150,000 and some that are closer to the 30,000. That average equates to more than the down payment on a starter home or even the total cost of a brand new American-made SUV. And carrying so much debt at a young age has implications towards how borrowers choose to live their lives and ultimately could lead to drastic negative impacts on not only their own future, but also the future of entire generations. There's no wonder that people are delaying making huge financial changes to their lifestyles. According to the 2024 survey by Bank of America, more than half of Gen Z adults say they don't make enough money to live the life they want to live due to the high cost of living, partially due to having student loan debt. In fact, from 2021 to 2023, more than 60% of Gen Z and millennials said they moved back home. That's huge. It's important to know that this is the highest rate of adults living at home with their parents, and the closest prior time before this was during the Great Depression, when 42% of adults lived with their family of origin. The Great Depression. Just want to put that home. So these statistics, I mean, they were really hard to read, and even harder to just hear the reality of the current and of the future that we face. So really just hearing all of that about student loans and the amount of carryover and the impacts that it can have on young people, or I won't just say young people. I mean, I mentioned that the highest amount of debt is from ages 35 to 49. It makes huge impacts on how people are choosing careers, buying a home, starting a family, especially like I mentioned for Gen Z and millennials. So how do you pass that? How do you think that it's influencing not just our people, but for generations to come?
Yeah, you know what? It's creating a cultural shift in those
Mm-hmm.
generations. I know that when I was going to school, that it was my parents' belief that if I went to college and I had a degree, that I would be recession proof in a way. I,
Absolutely.
I would
Yes.
I would have a degree and I could always fall back on it and I
Hmm.
could do whatever I want, but I would always have that degree.
Hmm.
And there would be a job. And as I graduated college, that started to shift. I know that the employment landscape really shifted to what I think we see today, trends of internships with free work, like people are
Yeah.
working internships for multiple months before there's a paycheck. It's not the same economy and not the same employment that our parents sort of put us on this track for, right? The whole
Right.
system
Right.
of education and going to college. And as you sort of pointed out, like it's exponentially worse for Black and Brown communities and
Hmm.
females, particularly. Like it just
Yep.
gets worse, right?
Absolutely.
And you're talking about the American dream, right? It includes having a car, it includes
Hmm.
having your career, it
Hmm.
includes having a family. And I
Yep.
think that with the challenges of student debt, when you take that stuff on, you immediately have to put stuff back, whether it's I can't afford a child, I can't
Mhm.
afford a house. It changes your living situation of people living with mom and dad. It is
Yep.
not uncommon for folks my age to be still living with their parents. And I
Yes.
think that even just socially, it's gone from I can't afford to move out to I can't afford to move out because my parents need help. And that
Yeah.
was very interesting because not only did the wealth get exhausted from their own pockets because the
Hmm.
job couldn't pay enough in order to save, but now we have to help out as a family in order to afford the home. And I think
Absolutely.
that is very, very interesting. So home ownership, career, life and family, all of those are delayed.
They absolutely are. And it's really interesting how people are starting to adapt to and cope with those types of limitation. Like you
Yes.
mentioned, it used to be kind of like passe to say, oh, I live with my parents and I'm 30 something. But these days it's really it has become much more acceptable just because it is the norm and it is something that we are all having to see and face that reality. And like you
Yeah.
mentioned, like my parents are similar to yours. Like this is what you do. Like you will have a great job and you're going to get this job because you have this degree. And these days it doesn't necessarily equate to that. So on top of just the student loan piece of it, just the high cost of living on top of having the student loans, we must all stay together so that we can help each other out.
Right.
So those types of limitations, and even going into careers that don't necessarily speak to who you want to be as a person or who you want, how you want to be represented. You choose the careers based on how, what those financial benefits are going to be for you.
Yes, no, absolutely. And I'm actually reading a very interesting book right now. It's called The Artist's Way. It's a spiritual path to higher creativity. And in that book, it's talking about how the reason why we do not choose a life in art. My background is in graphic design. I'm a web designer. I'm doing a podcast, like all of these really creative things
Yeah.
with a pretty corporate lens. And the reason why I didn't go into, like oil painting, something more fine art, was because of the fear that artists don't make money, right? We are making career choices based off of just the livelihood that we can afford. I think that, the extension of student debt, right? Can you become an artist, take on that student debt and still be able to afford that lifestyle?
Mm.
Yeah, it's
Right.
tough.
And just as you said it, I was like, no, you really can't. Like that's how do you even how will you do that? Like how will you, be able to save your just the 5% on the cost of, on the down payment for a home that you want to buy? Home prices have skyrocketed. So the $150,000 house that was, 10 years ago is now $400,000.
Yeah.
5% of that is not a small chunk of change. And who's able to save that amount of money with high cost of living on top of student loan debt.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
So what let's discuss for a second what role that debt plays in widening social and economic inequality. We kind of mentioned particularly for those that come from low income or even first generation households, minority students, and then I'm even going to say for women as well because of like I said most
Mhm.
women have the higher percentage of higher education degrees, everything from certificates to doctorate programs. Some of that I think especially for women is due to so that we can reach some level of equality and pay with men. But either way, like what role does student loan debt play in widening those gaps? What do you think?
Yeah, well, I mean, you kind of mentioned this before. Like, there is a very numerical difference between a white person who goes to college and a black
Mm,
person who goes to college. You
yeah,
mentioned that it's over $10,000 just
yeah,
just in student debts, right? I'm not even talking about a racial debt. And then women will face even bigger hurdles. We're talking about high debt, lower pay, and there's also systemic barriers as well. So, the idea and the conception that college and a degree will create a little bit more equality doesn't necessarily go because there's other systemic barriers there.
absolutely.
Um, Even going further, if you're a parent who's going to school and is
Mm,
taking on student debts, you're
yeah,
67% less likely to save for your college kids. So that
yeah.
just means that future generations don't necessarily have the same opportunity as well. We talked a little bit about homeownership and wealth building. It's difficult, especially if you're coming from a black or brown family. Like,
Mhm.
these things are impacting your community.
Absolutely, absolutely. And one thing that I found to be even more interesting is that while it is, in my opinion, it is widening student loan debt and period, is widening that social and economic inequality gap. It is also doing something interesting to the workforce. So
Mhm.
students are really, and we talked about, the implications of changing and altering career choices, but younger people are now starting to go more into trade. So when I was in school, of course, trade schools existed, but they weren't necessarily popularized at all. Like some students that I know did it, but you're like, oh, you're going to the trade school. It wasn't seen as like this cool experience that you were doing. But
Mhm.
it almost seems like these days that Gen Z students have caught wind of lower costs and potentially higher pay rates right outside of school. So there is no need for the giving away the free work with an internship or having the idea that I'm going to get a job, but are you really like are you sure with high unemployment numbers that is it's there that you may not actually be able to get the job in the career path that you have chosen, but that's
Mhm.
not necessarily the case in trade schools. And so I've really seen an uptick in enrollment in vocational programs for trade jobs that's even jumped about 16% from the previous year before. So students are looking into trades, things like carpentry, HVAC, construction, welding, things that you can really do right out of school. And the median age has actually decreased as well. Back when we were younger, I know I used to see all the plumbers, they're like 40 years old and 50 and 60, and they're older in age. But these days, that median age for starting that type of career is going into, mid 30s up to high 30s. So it's a big difference in who is doing the type of work. And it really, I guess, shows the resilience of young people to look for something other than the traditional way of what that American dream looks like.
We'll be right back after word from our sponsor.
Whether you're a longtime or first-time listener to Behavioral Health Today, you're probably familiar with Triad, the company that brings you this podcast. But you may not know that Triad also hosts a community for current and aspiring behavioral and mental health professionals, featuring trending content and education and career resources, all for free. If you are a behavioral or mental health professional, or you're studying to become one, join more than 80,000 people on Triad by claiming your free professional account today. Visit us at hellotriad.com/BHT. That's hellotriad.com/BHT and join the Triad community today.
And it's very interesting. At the very beginning, you talked about how you were doing extracurricular activities because it looked good on your college resume, right?
Yeah.
And I'm wondering what sort of ripples this will have in just sort of the students that are coming out of school if trade school is the end game, right?
Yeah.
Look, trade school is a great opportunity. I know a few people that have gone into different trade schools and they're coming out with really, really solid certification. They're doing very difficult work. Like it's very, very, very hands-on. It's very technical work, and they're coming out very smart. They also have access to labor unions and stuff like that. So there's strong benefits that can really support them, in their line of work. So there are a lot of benefits. But going back to college and sort of the expectation, like the well-rounded student that's going to have a lot of curricular activities is going to be the ideal student for college graduates, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And the ripple of people not necessarily eyeballing colleges, does it make those extracurricular activities like less enjoyable? For you not finding like the right rounded citizens that are entering into the workforce at 20 years old, 21 years old, than say the college graduates who might be entering a little bit later.
Yes. You bring up an interesting point. I hadn't really thought about that, but it is absolutely true. Like most people who have gone to college, you've had at least 4 years to spend some time cultivating who you will become, the type of adult you will become. You've made some mistakes. You've fallen down a bit. You might not have passed every class. You might have done some things that were not ethically sound, but you were able to spend some time developing who you would be as an adult. And I do wonder, like you said, does trade school, does it give those same benefits, or are they still able to create or push out these well-rounded adults?
Yeah. And it also sort of like begs the question, we've had some really great workforce futurists come onto our show and talk about sort of the philosophy, right? And this idea that if we start to look at a society where everybody is just a cog in a wheel and you have to fit a certain way in order to fit, it means that those that are on the outside that don't necessarily fit that role, it means that we start to look at their lives differently and not as equals, when we can be more inclusive and we can see the talents of everybody that's available. We can build a stronger society together, right? And I would not want those ideals to get lost with the popular rise of maybe trade schools that might be a little bit more focused, right? Like college students can help round out our society by just the access and the depth and the breadth of the courses that they take.
Absolutely. Because I know when I was in college, I have a chemistry degree of all the degrees to be a social worker, a chemistry degree undergrad. And we took so many courses that were not necessarily directly related to that. Things like religion and philosophy that I probably would not have taken had I not been made to take something outside of what I thought that I would, do as a career. And I honestly don't know enough about trade school programs to say that, there are those types of prerequisites, but that is a great point to bring up is what type of adult is it creating? Are they just as well-rounded? But then also I do think having more folks in trade programs kind of differentiates the society a bit more. And so you don't just have these set of, hey, I am in the National Honor Society and I went to college and I have this type of degree in college. So it brings about a more well-rounded society, not necessarily maybe a more rounded adult, but a more well-rounded society in which everyone is free to choose how they achieve that American dream. And I don't know that in my childhood or my younger years, we were all allowed to or encouraged to pursue things that were outside of that norm of going to college. Yeah. So we actually spoke on a previous BHT Bytes episode about some changes to federal policies, changes to things like pandemic relief. And so I started to do a bit more research because I did have student loans. Some of those were forgiven through former President Biden's public service loan forgiveness waivers. So thank you very much for that, President Biden. But there's been some changes with the recent administration to forbearance programs and different forgiveness plans. And I'm wondering, how has it shifted borrowers' behaviors or attitudes towards debt? Again, I can say that I feel a bit differently about debt at this time because I don't have any as far as student loans are concerned. But going into the pandemic, I did, and I didn't necessarily qualify for a lot of programs. And I was just paying them off, doing what I needed to do to pay them off. I did make some choices. Delayed a few things because I knew I needed to make these payments and I did not want my credit score to be affected negatively. But with changes that have occurred, I do wonder if they offered real relief or were they just temporary reprieves to an eventual having to pay back all your loans.
Right. And again, I want to sort of highlight one of the things you talked about, sort of a culture shift around this. And I think one of the interesting conversations that came out of the debt forgiveness, the student loan forgiveness, is that it really started to shift the blame away from individuals and started to look at the system differently. Now, the unfortunate part is that after Biden, there was no conversation. Like we didn't have Kamala come on and talk to that specific age group about how they were going to do things differently with student debt. And it sort of ended there. Now, I don't think the conversation is over. I think that public attitudes are changing and that America still views education as public good. But I think that some of these trends that we're outlining are some of the culture shifts that we're seeing.
Absolutely. And again, those culture shifts, it really, I think I'm starting to hear more young people talk about, well, this is the job that I would like to have, but I don't know if I'll be able to get it because of student loan debts. But maybe if I go into a service type of job, I do that for 10 years and they pay your loan off. That, that is how I was able to have mine paid off as well. So I do think it starts to change how the money is going to be used. As a young student loan borrower myself, there was not a ton of education about what repayment was going to really look like. There wasn't really very much education to parents about, so, your child is getting this loan. This is what it will look like. The interest will accrue from the moment they get it. Like those aren't conversations that were had with many of us. And I know that they, you do the loan education that you sign, the promise, all that stuff before you get the loan. But again, most students or most people that I know were thinking, I need this money to get me to where I need to go, not necessarily knowing all of the pieces that went into having to pay it back.
Yeah.
And that impact on their future.
Yeah, absolutely. I know for personal experience that I was very ignorant about how the loan process went. And I also say, like, in my time that the loan process had changed since I have two older sisters since they had done it as well.
Yeah.
So it's very difficult for us to understand a system that is constantly changing itself, and interest rates in my time of repayment had even changed as my loan was sold from one to another.
Yes.
Right. Like
Yes.
pretty good innovation in terms of trying to maintain that system, but also creates a very helpless situation for those that are repaying the debt.
Absolutely. I actually was reading as in doing research about this. And even in my own, personal interaction with folks that I know. So there were a lot of COVID things that were done. So in 2020, some things were passed with student loan payments, and you did not have to pay your payments, and then your interest did not accrue either. But what was not discussed in any detail at all is that the interest accrual restarted in 2023. And then any types of leeway that was given for, trying to get into a new repayment plan or even restarting your loans, most people didn't know that in January 2025, so just a few months ago, 6 months ago, that all of that leeway, all of the extra programs were gone. And so I'm reading stories, I'm hearing stories from most people that I know that like their credit score has dropped drastically in the last couple of months. And they're like, wait, what happened? I don't know what happened. And so then they go and check, it's their student loans, and they call the servicers, and the programs aren't there anymore. There aren't a ton of income-based repayment programs. There aren't a lot of the leeway given for forbearances are gone. I mean, some of it goes to that people aren't as savvy, and they aren't necessarily searching for the information. But at the same time, a lot of folks aren't getting any information to them or sent to them to say, hey, this is when your new payment plan will start. This is what you need to do if you're having trouble. There wasn't a lot of education sent out to folks on how they can get started again. And so now we're in a situation where, inflation is crazy, cost of living is crazy. Now you're having to pay your student loans again. And even more delaying potential growth, in your personal life, because now your credit score has dropped because you didn't know that you needed to pay your student loan debt, or there are some involuntary debt collections that are happening as of now, where some folks didn't even know this money was going to be coming out of their paychecks. And so for folks that are having trouble paying their bills already, this creates a whole nother level of stress and trauma around just trying to get an education to, better themselves and their futures. It's kind of scary.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's that same fear of getting into debt or having to make payments for something you can't afford, I think causes a lot of hesitancy for people like myself, to where, getting a mortgage for a house, that sounds really scary. You're talking about 30 years of my life, and I might not have a job in like the next 2. It just creates a lot of uncertainty. Even if the options for student loan forgiveness or change in your rate, being able to make updates to how much you pay, I think that those are tools that could be a little bit more known to borrowers that would make that whole situation less confusing. But I know like there is active force against those things. Like the lenders that are giving out these loans, they don't want you to be changing your interest rate or getting you to forgive debt. And those types of things don't make money.
Right. And so I think looking forward, there does need to be some level of shift in the amount of education that is not just available, but options and programs for folks, because it is still that American dream for you to go get this college degree and go be a productive citizen. But there isn't much talk about what happens on the real way to get to becoming that productive citizen and repaying those loans, or even some other options or alternative models that come at a cheaper cost, like community colleges. I know that many in my area, they offer free or really discounted rates in that first couple of years. So really sharing with young folks how they can make some alternatives and still be able to get towards that future that they see for themselves.
Yes. Yeah, that's a really good point. That's really well said.
Yeah. So student loan debt isn't just a matter of monthly payments. It's a force shaping how millions of Americans build their futures. It limits choices, delays progress, and for some, it shifts the entire trajectory of their lives. As we reflect on the scale and impact of this issue, we need to ask ourselves, are we supporting students with the tools, knowledge, and systems they need to succeed? Thanks for tuning in for today's conversation. If we want education to remain a ladder to opportunity, then it's time to rethink how we finance that climb and how we lift the weight of debt for those already carrying it. Thanks for joining us on today's episode of BHT Bytes, and we'll see you next time on Behavioral Health Today.
We appreciate all the support from our community, and if you like our show, one of the best ways you can support it is by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review. Behavioral Health Today is a podcast part of the Triad Behavioral Health Network, all rights reserved.